Right now, in the pre-dawn darkness of the Persian Gulf, a commercial tanker is sitting dead in the water. Its engine has been cut. Its crew has been ordered below deck. And standing on the bridge are members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, armed, composed, and in no particular hurry. The vessel's AIS transponder, the signal that tells the world where a ship is and where it is going, went dark 47 minutes ago. Somewhere in the operations centers of 3 different navies, analysts are watching that blank space on the maritime tracking grid and doing the same calculation. This is not a drill, and it is not a coincidence. Because within the same 24-hour window, Iran has done something it has never done simultaneously before. It has moved to physically obstruct commercial traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide choke point through which roughly 21 million barrels of oil pass every single day. And it has seized a vessel with documented ties to American commercial interests. 2 moves. 1 day. And the reaction from energy markets was immediate and precise. Brent crude jumped $9.40 in the first 30 minutes of trading after the news broke, touching $94 per barrel before retreating slightly. That number matters. We will come back to it. Here is what the mainstream media is not telling you. This is not a spontaneous escalation. It is not an impulsive act from a cornered regime. What happened in those 24 hours is the product of a strategic calculation that has been building for the better part of 3 years, and it was designed to achieve something very specific, not war, but leverage. The distinction matters enormously because war and leverage require completely different responses, and the world's governments are still arguing about which one this is. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly 3 things: why Iran moved on these 2 actions simultaneously, and what the coordination tells us about their strategic doctrine. How a 21-mile strait in the Persian Gulf transmits economic pain directly into the price of fuel, food, and freight in your country, and how fast that transmission happens, and what the 3 realistic scenarios are from this point forward, including the one that strategic analysts are privately discussing, but that no government will name publicly. Stay with me, because the details here are the story. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to May 2nd, 2019. That is the date the United States Treasury Department designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, the first time in American history that a branch of another nation's military had been given that designation. It was not a symbolic act. It meant that any company, financial institution, or individual doing business with the IRGC was exposed to criminal liability under American law. The economic walls around Iran tightened in ways that the previous sanctions architecture had never achieved. Iran did not respond with a press release. It responded with a doctrine. Between May 2019 and the end of that year, IRGC naval units seized or harassed 14 commercial vessels in Gulf waters. In June 2019, 2 oil tankers, the Norwegian-owned Front Altair and the Japanese-owned Kokuka Courageous, were struck by limpet mines in the Gulf of Oman. The U.S. Navy released footage of what it said were IRGC units removing an unexploded mine from the Kokuka's hull. Tehran denied involvement. But the message had been delivered in a language that energy markets understood perfectly. Hormuz is a tool, and Iran knows how to use it. Then came the 2020 killing of IRGC Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in a U.S. drone strike at Baghdad International Airport on January 3. The geopolitical temperature in the Gulf crossed a threshold that year that it has never fully retreated from. Iran swore publicly and repeatedly to avenge Soleimani's death. Some of that promise was fulfilled with ballistic missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq. But the deeper response has been structural, a steady, methodical expansion of Iran's capacity to threaten, surveil, and interdict shipping in the Gulf region. Between 2022 and 2024, Iran conducted what analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies cataloged as at least 17 seizures or attempted seizures of commercial vessels in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman. The targets were not random. They followed a pattern: vessels with ownership structures connected to Israeli interests, vessels linked to U.S. sanction enforcement activities, and occasionally vessels whose seizure could be traded in diplomatic backchannels for the release of frozen Iranian assets or detained Iranian nationals. The IRGC Navy, specifically its fast boat flotillas operating out of Bandar Abbas and the island bases of Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tons, all of them sitting directly astride the strait, has in this period developed what military analysts now describe as a mature harassment and seizure doctrine. They know the shipping lanes. They know which class of vessel can be boarded and which cannot. They know the legal gray zones in international maritime law. And they have demonstrated repeatedly that they are willing to use these capabilities as a pressure valve, turning it up when they want attention, easing it when they want negotiation. What changed in the 72 hours before the current seizure was a convergence of three factors. First, a U.S. court had just ruled to release proceeds from the sale of Iranian oil seized aboard a tanker called the Suez Rajan, approximately $75 million, to families of victims of Iranian-linked terror attacks, rather than returning it to Tehran. Second, nuclear negotiations in Oman, which had been quietly progressing through a backchannel mediated by the Omani Foreign Ministry, had collapsed when a new set of American preconditions were delivered. And third, the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, which Iran supports materially and which has kept global shipping costs elevated since late 2023, was showing signs of degrading under sustained US and UK airstrikes. Tehran needed to demonstrate that if one pressure point was being closed, it could open another. The simultaneous seizure of the vessel and the announcement of traffic control measures in the strait, framed by Iranian state media not as a blockade, but as a maritime security operation, was that demonstration. That threshold has now been crossed. And the world's energy markets, supply chains, and diplomatic backchannels are all recalibrating at the same time. Let us now examine what Iran actually did and what it reveals about their current military capability and doctrine. Because the details here are more significant than the headlines suggest. The seizure was executed by fast interdiction craft, almost certainly the IRGC's Saraj class or Ashura class speedboats, which operate in flotillas of 6 to 12 vessels and are capable of reaching speeds of 70 knots. These are not improvised weapons. They are purpose-built interdiction platforms designed specifically for the confined waters of the Gulf, where the narrow geography negates the advantages of larger naval vessels. A U.S. Navy destroyer with a standard complement and its full sensor suite cannot effectively pursue and intercept these craft in shallow littoral waters without risking collision, mine threat, or escalation optics that Tehran has learned to exploit. The boarding team was drawn from the IRGC's Marine Special Operations Unit, trained specifically for this type of action, rehearsed dozens of times in exercises over the past 4 years, and equipped with communications jamming equipment that suppressed the vessel's distress signal for a period of approximately 22 minutes before the crew's personal satellite communicator was used to alert the vessel's management company. That detail, the 22-minute suppression window, is new. It suggests that IRGC electronic warfare capability in the maritime domain has matured significantly since the 2019-era operations. Here is something that no military strategist had seen in quite this form in modern Gulf history: the simultaneous announcement of what Iran is calling a maritime security zone in a corridor of the strait coinciding with an active vessel seizure. Previous Iranian pressure operations were sequential. You would see a harassment campaign, then an escalation, then a seizure, each step calibrated to gauge international response before proceeding to the next. What happened here was the execution of 2 pressure instruments at the same time. Military analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London have noted that this suggests Iran is either willing to absorb greater risk than before, or, and this is the more concerning interpretation, it has assessed that the current geopolitical environment, with U.S. attention fragmented across Ukraine, the Taiwan Strait, and domestic politics, means that the cost of simultaneous action is lower than it has been at any point in the past decade. The Maritime Security Zone announcement deserves particular attention. Iran has invoked Article 25 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the right of coastal states to take measures in their territorial waters necessary for their security. to justify what is effectively a checkpoint requirement in international waters. This is legally contested. The Strait of Hormuz is subject to transit passage rights under UNCLOS Article 38, which cannot be suspended even by coastal states. But Iran has not ratified the relevant provisions of UNCLOS in a way that binds it to that interpretation, and it has done something legally clever. It has not announced a blockade. It has announced a vessel traffic service, requiring commercial shipping to notify Iranian maritime authorities before transiting a defined corridor. The practical effect may be the same as a partial obstruction, but the legal framing makes it significantly harder for the U.S. or its allies to characterize the action as an act of war under international law. What military options are now on the table? The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, has pre-positioned guided missile destroyers in the Gulf of Oman since 2022. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is currently within operational range of the strait. U.S. and coalition aircraft maintain persistent maritime patrol coverage. But here is what military strategists are actually saying privately. A kinetic response to the vessel seizure, firing on IRGC craft, risks the kind of immediate escalation that transforms a leverage play into a shooting war. Iran has anti-ship missile batteries along its Gulf coastline, including the indigenously produced Noor missile, which has a range of approximately 170 kilometers and is derived from the Chinese C-802. A sustained exchange in the Gulf, even a limited one, would almost certainly result in additional vessel damage or loss, spiking insurance rates and effectively closing the strait to commercial traffic even without a formal blockade. That is almost certainly what Iran is hoping someone will threaten, because the threat alone does the economic work. What changed is this. Until now, the international community could point to a clear separation between Iran's nuclear pressure tactics and its maritime pressure tactics. Those two tracks are now converging. And the convergence is the message. Let me put this in concrete terms, because this is where the Strait of Hormuz stops being a foreign policy problem and becomes your problem. The immediate market reaction was swift and directional. Brent crude, which had been trading at $84.60 per barrel the previous session, opened at $91.20 on the morning of the seizure announcement and touched $94 before retreating to around $89 as U.S. military officials signaled measured restraint. That is roughly a $9 swing in under 3 hours. WTI crude moved in parallel, rising from $80.40 to $87.15 at peak. Natural gas futures in Europe, which trade heavily on LNG import expectations from the Gulf, rose 14% in a single session. Now here is the transmission mechanism, because the price at the exchange is not where this ends, it is where it begins. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an oil route. It is an LNG route. Qatar, which is the world's second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, routes essentially all of its LNG exports through the strait. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, three of the world's largest LNG importers, receive between 30 and 45% of their total natural gas supply through this choke point. Japan currently holds approximately 14 days of LNG reserves above its strategic buffer, according to data from the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy. South Korea holds roughly 20 days. These are not comfortable margins for an unresolved closure scenario. India imports approximately 45% of its crude oil from the Gulf region, representing somewhere between 18 and 22 days of import cover, depending on the season and its strategic petroleum reserve drawdown calculations. The shipping cost impact is already visible. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the strait jumped 0.35 percentage points within hours of the announcement, a number that sounds small until you understand that it represents roughly $750,000 in additional cost per voyage for a VLCC, a very large crude carrier. Those costs do not disappear. They move through the supply chain. The shipping companies pass them to the commodity traders. The commodity traders pass them to the refiners. The refiners embed them in the wholesale price of fuel. And somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks from today, that is the typical lag in this transmission system, you will see them at the pump. Downstream from the energy price is the fertilizer price. The Gulf region is a major supplier of ammonia and urea, which are nitrogen fertilizers produced from natural gas. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE together account for a significant share of global ammonia export capacity. When Gulf gas prices rise and shipping costs spike simultaneously, the cost of nitrogen fertilizer to farmers in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Africa rises with it. And when fertilizer becomes more expensive or uncertain in supply, planting decisions change. Planting decisions changed in the 2022 Gulf crisis correlate not perfectly, but measurably, with food price increases that materialized 6 to 9 months later. We are watching that mechanism engage again right now. The countries most exposed in the near term are those with the least buffer. Pakistan, with foreign exchange reserves at critically constrained levels and around 25 to 30 days of import coverage, is acutely vulnerable to any sustained price increase in crude. Sri Lanka, which barely survived an energy-driven economic collapse in 2022, has rebuilt its reserves to approximately 90 days of import cover, but its political tolerance for another price shock is essentially zero. Bangladesh, which imports virtually all of its crude and LNG, and whose textile export economy runs on consistent energy pricing, faces a structural squeeze if Gulf disruption extends beyond 2 weeks. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from an IRGC speedboat boarding a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz to the price of cooking gas in Karachi, the price of diesel in Dhaka, and the price you pay for goods made in factories powered by fuel that moved through that 21-mile passage. If you want to understand how these events move through your economy before the mainstream media catches up, because there is always a lag between the geopolitical event and the economic coverage, make sure you are subscribed. We track this in real time, and the next move in this story will happen faster than the news cycle. The timeline of pain, if this remains unresolved, follows a predictable curve. In the first week, markets price in risk premium. You see it in crude, in shipping, in insurance. In weeks 2 through 4, vessel rerouting begins. Ships that would normally transit the strait begin diverting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 14 to 21 days to voyage times and increasing fuel consumption by approximately 40% per trip. That voyage extension effectively removes tanker capacity from the market, tightening supply further even if Iranian action does not physically block a single additional vessel. In weeks 4 through 8, the price signals reach retail fuel, then freight, then food. And at week 8, the political pressure on governments to resolve the situation by any means necessary, including concessions they would not have considered at week 1, becomes very difficult to contain. Here is what the diplomatic picture looks like beneath the surface, because the public statements from governments in this moment are almost universally the opposite of what their private incentives suggest. Washington's public posture is firm. The State Department has called the seizure a violation of international law and demanded the immediate release of the vessel and crew. The Pentagon has stated that freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is a vital U.S. national interest. None of that is surprising. What is more instructive is what Washington is not doing. It is not invoking military authorization language. It is not declaring a crisis that requires emergency congressional action. And it is not announcing additional naval deployments beyond those already in the region. The signal in the silence is de-escalation preference. Iran's red line in this moment is clear even if it is not stated publicly: no military strike on IRGC assets or Iranian territory, and the release of the frozen oil proceeds from the Suez Rajan ruling. Those are the two things Tehran needs to be able to show its domestic audience as evidence that the pressure worked. The IRGC's domestic political standing depends on demonstrating that its Gulf operations are not costless adventures. They have to yield something tangible. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, are caught in an acute dilemma. They have spent the past 3 years quietly normalizing relations with Iran under Chinese mediation, culminating in the March 2023 Beijing agreement. They do not want to be seen as Washington's proxies in a confrontation with Tehran, because they need the normalization process to hold. But they also cannot afford sustained Hormuz disruption, because their own export revenues transit the same choke point. Saudi Aramco's oil moves through the east-west pipeline to Yanbu for Red Sea loading, partially bypassing the strait, but that route handles only about half of Saudi crude capacity. The UAE has no alternative route at all. Their private incentive is to see this resolved quickly and quietly, regardless of who is seen to blink. China's position is perhaps the most complicated. China is simultaneously Iran's largest oil customer, importing approximately 1.4 million barrels per day at discounted rates that bypass U.S. sanctions, and one of the primary voices calling for Gulf stability. Beijing does not want Hormuz disrupted any more than Tokyo does. But it also calculates that sustained tension in the Gulf keeps Washington occupied, keeps oil markets volatile in ways that complicate Western economic planning, and maintains Iran's dependency on Chinese economic relationships. The public position from Beijing is a call for restraint and dialogue. The private incentive is studied in action. Oman is, as it has been for 30 years, the actual mediator. Muscat maintained diplomatic relations with Tehran throughout the era of full U.S. sanctions. The Omani foreign minister has back-channel relationships with both the IRGC leadership and the U.S. National Security Council. When there is a deal to be made in the Gulf, and historically, there usually is, it gets made first in a room in Muscat. Watch whether the Omani foreign minister's travel schedule changes in the next 10 days. That will tell you more about the trajectory of this situation than any press conference. Pakistan is an unexpected but not insignificant player. Islamabad has military-to-military relationships with both the U.S. and Iran, has in the past facilitated prisoner exchanges involving U.S. citizens held in Iranian custody, and has its own economic stake in Gulf stability, given the remittances sent home by the Pakistani diaspora working in the Gulf states. A quiet Pakistani diplomatic approach is not impossible, though it would need to be explicitly requested by Washington. We are now at the point in this analysis where the uncertainty is highest and the stakes are clearest. Strategic analysts are working through 3 distinct scenarios, and I want to walk you through each one with the specificity that this situation demands. The first scenario is negotiated resolution. This is possible, it has precedent, and it requires the following. Iran releases the seized vessel and its crew in exchange for a private assurance, not public, because Iran cannot be seen to have capitulated, that the Suez-Rajan proceeds issue will be revisited through a legal mechanism that returns some value to Iran. The Maritime Security Zone announcement is quietly walked back, framed by Tehran as a completed inspection exercise. The United States does not carry out any military action. Both sides can tell their domestic audiences something that resembles a win. The channel for this negotiation is almost certainly Oman, with possible supporting communication through the Swiss diplomatic mission that represents U.S. interests in Tehran. It requires approximately 7 to 14 days of back-channel pressure, and it is fragile. If any military incident occurs in the strait during that window, a collision, a warning shot, an accident, the negotiating space collapses. The second scenario is continued attrition. This is the scenario where neither side makes a decisive move. The vessel remains seized for weeks rather than days, and Iran's maritime security zone requirements create a soft disruption to commercial traffic without a hard closure. In this scenario, the economic costs accumulate gradually. Shipping companies begin rerouting a percentage of their Gulf transits around the Cape. Insurance premiums remain elevated, but not catastrophic. Oil trades in a range of $88 to $96 per barrel. Japan, South Korea, and India accelerate drawdowns of their strategic petroleum reserves, lobbying Washington for a diplomatic resolution. The sustained conflict costs roughly $200 million per week in additional global shipping expenses, according to estimates from maritime consultancy Drewry, and the political pressure on the Biden, or whichever, administration builds week by week. In this scenario, Iran achieves its leverage goal. It makes the status quo painful enough that the other parties begin offering concessions to restore it. The third scenario is the one that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. This is catastrophic escalation, and it begins not with a decision but with a mistake. A U.S. naval vessel enforcing freedom of navigation fires warning shots at an IRGC fast boat flotilla that does not immediately disperse. Iran interprets this as an attack and retaliates with its land-based anti-ship missile batteries, Noor or Qatar class, targeting U.S. naval assets in the Gulf. One U.S. vessel is hit. At that point, the calculation changes entirely. The authorization for use of military force is invoked. U.S. airstrikes on IRGC naval bases at Bandar Abbas and Jask follow within hours. Iran launches ballistic missiles, Ahmad or Shahab 3 class, with ranges of 1,700 to 2,000 kilometers at U.S. forward operating positions in the region. The Strait of Hormuz closes not because Iran declared it closed, but because no commercial insurer on Earth will cover a vessel transiting an active combat zone. In that scenario, the price of oil does not spike to $94. It spikes to somewhere between $130 and $160, according to scenario modeling from Goldman Sachs published after the 2019 tanker attacks. Global LNG supply to Japan and South Korea is interrupted for a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks while alternative supply routes are secured. Economies already operating near stall speed tip into recession. And the IRGC's proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi Shia militias, activates in multiple theaters simultaneously, spreading the military response then across a geography that the U.S. military has not operated in at this scale since 2003. That threshold, once crossed, does not uncross. The Persian Gulf that existed before a U.S.-Iran exchange of fire is not coming back. Watch crude prices in the first trading hour every morning for the next 2 weeks. Watch the Omani foreign minister's official travel calendar. Watch whether commercial shipping companies begin formally notifying their customers of Cape of Good Hope rerouting options. Those 3 things will tell you, with more precision than any press conference or official statement, which of the 3 scenarios is actually unfolding. Because here is the direct line that this moment draws into your daily life. The gas you put in your car or the electricity that heats your home, priced in part by crude markets that are responding to what happened in the Strait in the last 24 hours. The shipping cost embedded in every piece of electronics, clothing, or food that traveled by container ship, now carrying a war risk surcharge that did not exist 48 hours ago. The fertilizer that will grow next year's wheat, rice, and corn in South and Southeast Asia, priced partly off Gulf natural gas that is now trading at a 14% premium. The airline ticket you might buy this spring, now subject to fuel surcharge recalculations that carriers will file with aviation authorities within 30 days. The price of plastics, of chemicals, of industrial inputs that derive from petrochemical feedstocks, all of them recalibrating to a new baseline that started moving the moment that AIS transponder went dark. This is not a Gulf story. It is a global pricing story told through geography. And here is the thing the headlines aren't telling you. The most consequential decisions in this situation will not be made in Washington or Tehran. They will be made in Tokyo, Seoul, New Delhi, and Riyadh by governments that hold strategic reserves, tanker fleets, and diplomatic leverage, and whose private desperation for resolution will shape the back-channel negotiations more than any American press briefing or Iranian state television broadcast. The historical weight of this moment is considerable. The Strait of Hormuz has been called the world's most important oil choke point for decades, but that description has always carried an implicit qualifier. It is important in the abstract, in the planning documents, in the academic papers. What is happening now is the abstraction becoming concrete. The scenarios that energy security analysts have been writing about since the 1970s are not simulations anymore. They are operational. The open question, and it is genuine, not rhetorical, is this: does Iran believe it can achieve its diplomatic objectives through sustained maritime pressure without triggering a military response that spirals beyond its ability to control? Tehran has made that calculation correctly before, in 2019 and 2020. But the geopolitical context has changed. The U.S. domestic political environment has changed. The region's alignment architecture has changed. And the speed at which a maritime incident can escalate in an era of real-time social media, hair-trigger financial markets, and forward-deployed military assets operating under standing rules of engagement has changed in ways that even the most experienced Gulf strategists have not fully stress-tested. We will be watching this closely and covering every significant development as it happens. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.